The silence lasted decades. Not the quiet kind, the loud kind, the kind that echoes through closed studio doors, unreturned phone calls, and projects that almost happened, but didn't. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the question no one in Hollywood wanted to ask out loud, until now. Why did Clint Eastwood, one of the most powerful filmmakers in history, refuse to ever work with Rob Reiner? Not once. Not even when the money was right. Not when the script was strong. Not when everyone else said, just let it go. Clint didn't. And according to people close to him, he never forgot what happened during one of the most politically charged eras Hollywood has ever seen. Because this wasn't about ego. It wasn't about creative differences. It wasn't about scheduling conflicts. It was about power, about punishment, and about what happens when someone decides you're dangerous to the industry. Dangerous. Let that word sit for a moment. What does that even mean in a town built on rebellion, outsiders, and rule breakers? And more importantly, who gets to decide? Tonight, we're opening a story that Hollywood tried very hard to keep closed. A story of whispered phone calls, quiet pressure, and an invisible line you were never supposed to cross. A story about how politics didn't just divide America, but quietly reshaped careers behind the scenes. And it starts with a man who built his entire legend on standing alone. Clint Eastwood. By the time Clint reached the height of his career, he was more than an actor, more than a director. He was a symbol of stoicism, of restraint, of the kind of masculinity that didn't ask for permission or applause. He didn't campaign for approval. He didn't soften his edges. And most importantly, he didn't change his views to fit the room. That alone made him an anomaly in modern Hollywood. While the industry increasingly leaned one direction, politically, culturally, ideologically, Clint stayed exactly where he was. Calm, measured, unapologetic. He spoke when he wanted. He stayed silent when others shouted. And he never explained himself. But silence doesn't mean invisibility. Behind the scenes, Hollywood was changing fast. Studios merged. Power consolidated. Social circles tightened. And politics stopped being something discussed quietly over dinner. It became a loyalty test. You were either aligned, or you were a problem. And according to multiple industry insiders, Clint Eastwood was quietly being labeled the latter. Not because of anything he did on screen, but because of what he represented off it. This was the era when influence mattered more than contracts. When reputations were shaped not by box office numbers, but by who vouched for you, or who warned others away. Phone calls mattered. Dinners mattered. Private conversations mattered most of all. And in those conversations, one name kept coming up alongside Clint's. Rob Reiner. At the time, Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a kingmaker. A man with access, credibility, and deep relationships across studios, agencies, and production companies. He had a reputation for being passionate, vocal, politically engaged. Some admired that. Others feared it. Because passion, when paired with influence, can quietly become a weapon, according to long-standing industry rumors. Never proven in court, never publicly acknowledged, but repeated often enough to make people nervous. Reiner believed certain voices in Hollywood weren't just wrong. They were harmful. And Clint Eastwood's name allegedly landed squarely in that category. Dangerous to the industry. What does that label do? It doesn't come with an announcement. There's no press release. No public feud. Instead, doors stop opening. Meetings get postponed. Projects stall in development. Scripts aren't quite right anymore. Financing falls apart at the last minute. And no one ever tells you why. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Clint Eastwood didn't lash out. He didn't issue statements. He didn't start a counter-campaign. He just noticed. He noticed who stopped calling. He noticed which collaborations never materialized. He noticed which names were suddenly attached to warnings rather than opportunities. And he noticed one pattern that never changed. Rob Reiner was always nearby, always connected, always influential, always vocal. Was it coincidence? Or was it something far more deliberate? People close to Clint say he understood something early on that most actors never grasp until it's too late. In Hollywood, you don't have to be attacked publicly to be punished privately. All it takes is a few conversations behind closed doors. A suggestion here, a concern there. A carefully placed sentence like, he's complicated, or he might bring problems. Problems. Another word that sounds harmless until you realize how careers die from it. Clint kept working, but on his terms. He directed his own films, produced through his own companies, stayed fiercely independent. But one thing never happened. He never worked with Rob Reiner. Not once. Even when opportunities arose that would have made perfect sense creatively. Even when people tried to broker peace. Even when the industry expected it. Clint said no. And when asked why, he didn't elaborate. He just moved on. Years passed. The industry changed again. New controversies replaced old ones. And yet, that silence remained. Until recently. Because something shifted. Not in Clint's career, but in Hollywood's mood. Suddenly, people started talking about blacklisting again. Not as a relic of the past, but as a modern reality with different language and different rules. Suddenly, stories resurfaced. Patterns were re-examined. Old grudges felt less dangerous to acknowledge. And according to those close to Clint Eastwood, that's when he finally allowed the truth to surface. Not in a press conference, not in a tell-all interview, but in quiet confirmation. Yes, he remembered. And yes, he believed someone tried to block him. Not because of his work, but because of his beliefs. That revelation changes everything. Because if someone like Clint Eastwood, untouchable, legendary, financially independent, felt the pressure, what happened to everyone else? How many careers bent quietly under the same invisible weight? How many voices softened themselves just enough to survive? And how many never even realized why they disappeared? This story matters now because Hollywood is at a crossroads. Audiences are questioning narratives. Creators are pushing back. And the myth of absolute creative freedom is cracking under scrutiny. Clint Eastwood didn't play the game. And according to those who know him best, he paid a price for that, even if it never broke him. But here's the part no one talks about. Clint didn't just refuse to work with Rob Reiner out of pride. He refused because, in his mind, some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. Trust was broken. Respect was gone. And forgiveness? That was never on the table. And just when you think this story is about two powerful men and an old Hollywood feud, you realize it's about something much bigger. About how ideology becomes currency. About how silence becomes strategy. About how careers can be shaped or quietly stalled by forces the public never sees. And what came next didn't happen in public. It happened in whispers, in backrooms, in moments that would only make sense years later. Because the deeper you go into this story, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was a warning. And the next chapter reveals exactly how that warning may have been delivered, and why Clint Eastwood decided that some battles are best fought by never showing up at all. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The warning didn't arrive as a threat. There was no angry voicemail, no heated confrontation, no dramatic showdown in a studio hallway. That's not how Hollywood works when it wants to hurt you. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost politely. A meeting that never happened. A project that stalled without explanation. A producer who suddenly couldn't get financing anymore. At first, Clint Eastwood didn't think much of it. Why would he? By this point, Clint was already a living legend. Box office gold. An Oscar winner. A man whose name alone could greenlight a film. He had leverage most actors only dreamed of. Which is why what happened next was so unsettling. Because leverage, Clint would soon learn, means nothing if the culture turns against you. It started during one of the most volatile political periods Hollywood had seen in decades. Tempers were high. Lines were drawn. Silence was no longer neutral. You were expected to signal where you stood. And Clint didn't. That, according to insiders, was his first mistake. Clint Eastwood never chased approval. He didn't attend every fundraiser. Didn't flood interviews with talking points. Didn't adjust his language to match the moment. He believed your work should speak for itself. But in a town increasingly obsessed with messaging, that belief was starting to look like defiance. And defiance, in Hollywood, makes people nervous. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The industry doesn't fear loud rebels. It fears respected ones. People who don't need the system, but still succeed inside it. That was Clint. And that's where Rob Reiner enters the picture in a much more serious way. Reiner wasn't just another director with opinions. He was deeply embedded in the social and political fabric of Hollywood. He spoke openly, forcefully, constantly. And when Rob Reiner believed something, he didn't whisper it. He campaigned. People who worked around him at the time describe a man who saw Hollywood not just as an entertainment industry, but as a cultural battleground. Movies mattered, messages mattered, and who got platforms mattered most of all. So when Clint Eastwood continued to operate outside that ideological framework, it didn't go unnoticed. According to multiple long-standing accounts, Reiner began privately questioning whether Clint should continue being elevated the way he was. Not publicly, not on camera, but in rooms where decisions were actually made. And here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Because when someone with Reiner's influence labels you as dangerous, that word doesn't stay theoretical. It travels. It gets repeated, rephrased, softened just enough to sound reasonable. He might bring controversy. He could complicate things. Studios don't want the distraction. Distraction, Hollywood's favorite excuse. Suddenly, Clint's name wasn't just attached to talent. It was attached to risk. And risk is something executives avoid at all costs, even when the numbers don't justify the fear, especially when the fear is ideological rather than financial. Now here's the part that most people misunderstand. Blacklisting doesn't look like exile. It looks like isolation. You still work. You still get praised. You just stop getting invited into certain rooms. You stop being considered for certain collaborations. And when Clint looked around, he noticed something unsettling. Projects involving Rob Reiner? He was never in the conversation. Not once. And when intermediaries tried to bridge the gap, the answer always came back the same way. Non-committal. Delayed. Eventually silent. Clint didn't need confirmation. He understood patterns. And the pattern was clear. Someone had decided that Clint Eastwood's independence was no longer tolerable. But Clint did something few people would dare to do. He didn't chase the approval back. He pulled away. He doubled down on self-reliance. He made films on his own terms, with his own teams, through his own production structures. If doors closed, he built new ones. But make no mistake, that choice wasn't without cost. Because even legends feel the chill when the room changes temperature. And according to those close to Clint, he felt it. He just refused to let it change him. This is where the emotional divide hardened into something permanent. Clint believed that disagreement was part of art. Rob Reiner, by contrast, was seen by critics as believing disagreement was a threat. Two philosophies, two worldviews, and only one could dominate the industry without friction. Here's a question for you. If someone quietly tried to limit your opportunities because of how you think, not what you did, would you ever forget it? Clint didn't. He stored it away, not as resentment, but as information. And that information guided every decision he made going forward. No collaborations, no reconciliations, no second chances. To Clint, once someone weaponized influence against you, the relationship was over. Forever. Years later, when asked indirectly about working with certain figures, Clint's responses were always measured. Calm, almost gentle, but insiders noticed what he didn't say. He never denied the tension. He never dismissed the rumors. And he never softened his stance. Because by then, the damage had already been done. And the irony? While Clint Eastwood continued making films that explored moral ambiguity, forgiveness, and redemption, he himself refused to grant any to the people who tried to control him. That contradiction haunted Hollywood. How could a man so fascinated by mercy be so unwilling to extend it personally? The answer, according to those closest to him, is simple. Clint believed creative differences could be resolved, but moral betrayal could not. And in his mind, trying to quietly erase someone's opportunities crossed a line that no apology could fix. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't regenerate. What most people never realized was that this silent standoff didn't stay contained. It influenced casting decisions, studio alliances, which stories got told, and which never left development hell. And the deeper you look, the more uncomfortable the question becomes. How many artists adjusted their voices after watching what happened to Clint? How many decided silence was safer than honesty? Because if someone as powerful as Clint Eastwood could feel the pressure, what chance did anyone else have? But the most unsettling part of this chapter isn't what Clint lost. It's what Hollywood learned. That pressure works. That labels stick. And that you don't need public scandals to shape behavior, just enough fear behind the scenes. And as this quiet conflict simmered, something else was happening. The political climate intensified. The industry grew louder. And Rob Reiner's influence didn't fade, it expanded. Which brings us to the moment when this private feud stopped being just personal and started becoming symbolic of a much larger cultural war inside Hollywood itself. Because what came next wasn't just about Clint Eastwood anymore. It was about who gets to belong and who gets quietly pushed out. But what came next would force Clint to make a decision that would define the rest of his career and reveal just how far he was willing to go to never be controlled again. And no one, not even those closest to him, expected how absolute that decision would be. Hollywood never publishes its rules. There's no handbook, no orientation, no warning label stapled to your contract. But everyone who survives long enough learns them. And Clint Eastwood learned them the hard way. Here's the first unwritten rule. Success doesn't protect you from punishment. In fact, it can make you a bigger target. Because when you're powerful, your refusal to conform isn't just personal, it's symbolic. And symbols scare systems that rely on uniformity. By the time this silent conflict was taking shape, Hollywood wasn't just making movies anymore. It was managing narratives, curating values, deciding which voices felt safe. Safe didn't mean talented. Safe didn't mean profitable. Safe meant predictable. Clint Eastwood was none of those things. He was disciplined, yes. Measured, absolutely. But predictable? Never. He didn't signal allegiance the way others did. He didn't wrap his opinions in irony or humor. He didn't soften edges to avoid discomfort. And according to insiders, that refusal made executives uneasy. Because unpredictability isn't dangerous when it comes from outsiders. It's dangerous when it comes from someone people listen to. This is where the second unwritten rule comes in. Influence matters more than authority. Rob Reiner didn't need to issue ultimatums. He didn't need to threaten studios. He didn't need to say, "Don't work with Clint Eastwood." All he had to do was frame the conversation, to introduce doubt, to suggest consequences, to redefine risk. People who sat in those rooms years ago described the same atmosphere. Not hostility, not aggression. Concern. Concern is far more effective. Concern sounds responsible. Concern sounds protective. Concern makes people feel smart for avoiding problems before they happen. And when concern attaches itself to a name, that name starts to carry weight. Not the good kind. Here's how it plays out. A producer mentions Clint Eastwood as a possible collaborator. Someone else shifts in their chair. Another voice says, "He's talented, obviously, but..." That word, "but," is where careers bend. But the climate is complicated right now. But we don't want distractions. But the studio is being careful. Careful. Another innocent word with sharp edges. No one ever says who's being careful. No one ever explains what they're careful of. They don't have to. The implication does all the work. Clint didn't hear these conversations directly. That's important. Blacklisting, when it exists, thrives on distance. You're never supposed to know. But Clint didn't need transcripts. He saw outcomes. And outcomes tell the truth people won't. He noticed which projects moved forward without him. Which collaborators suddenly went quiet. Which doors stayed closed just long enough to matter. And here's the contradiction that made it impossible to ignore. At the same time Clint was supposedly too risky, his films kept succeeding. Audiences showed up. Awards followed. Critics engaged. The numbers didn't match the fear. Which raises a dangerous question. If the risk wasn't financial, what was it? The answer, whispered but rarely spoken, was ideological. Hollywood wasn't afraid Clint would fail. Hollywood was afraid Clint would influence. Influence without alignment. Influence without permission. That's when Clint made a decision that surprised even those closest to him. He stopped trying to understand the system and started ignoring it entirely. This is where the third unwritten rule comes in. If you can't control the narrative, control your access. Clint already had something most people never achieve: autonomy. He had his own production pipelines, his own trusted collaborators, his own rhythm. So instead of fighting the quiet resistance, he stepped around it. He chose projects that didn't require approval from the same circles. He avoided environments where ideology mattered more than execution. And slowly, deliberately, he removed himself from spaces where influence was being used as leverage. But here's the thing about withdrawal. People notice. And in Hollywood, absence is read as defiance. To some, Clint's refusal to engage looked like arrogance. To others, it looked like a warning. Because if someone as iconic as Clint Eastwood could operate independently and thrive, It exposed a weakness in the system. It showed that compliance wasn't inevitable, and that made certain people deeply uncomfortable. This is where Rob Reiner's role becomes more complicated. Because publicly, Reiner continued to speak about values, responsibility, and the role of artists in shaping culture. Privately, according to multiple accounts, he grew increasingly frustrated with figures who refused to fall in line. Not because they disagreed, but because they refused to care. Clint Eastwood didn't argue back. He didn't countermessage. He didn't engage in public debate. He just kept making movies. And silence, in a polarized environment, can feel like opposition. Here's a question for you. What bothers people more? Someone who challenges them openly, or someone who ignores them entirely? Clint chose the second path, and that choice turned a quiet tension into something permanent. Because once you stop needing approval, approval loses its power. But it doesn't lose its resentment. Insiders say this is when the relationship between Clint and Rob Reiner moved from strained to irreparable. Not because of anything said, but because of what wasn't. There were no peace talks, no mutual friends stepping in, no attempts to clear the air. Both men simply continued on parallel tracks that never intersected, and that absence became its own statement. Studios noticed. Agents noticed. People began to understand that if a project involved Rob Reiner, Clint Eastwood would not be part of it. Ever. No explanation required. The line had been drawn, and that line wasn't just personal. It was ideological. It separated those who believed Hollywood should guide culture from those who believed culture should speak for itself. And here's where the story takes another turn. Because as the industry continued to evolve, the tools of influence became more sophisticated. Public pressure, social signaling, reputational framing. The very tactics Clint had sidestepped were now being normalized, which meant something unsettling. What Clint experienced early on was becoming standard practice. Suddenly, younger artists began whispering about the same patterns. Projects falling apart, opportunities vanishing, labels being quietly attached. The difference? They didn't have Clint's leverage. And watching from a distance, Clint Eastwood saw something he didn't like. The system he'd escaped was tightening around others. And while he never positioned himself as a martyr, he understood the implications. If silence allowed this to continue, what did that say about the industry he loved? This is where Clint's long memory became something else. Not resentment. Resolve. He wasn't going to fight publicly, but he wasn't going to forget either. And that refusal, to forget, to forgive, to normalize what he believed was wrong, would eventually lead to a moment when Clint finally confirmed what many had suspected all along. Not loudly, not angrily, but clearly enough that there was no mistaking it. And when that confirmation surfaced, it didn't just reopen old wounds. It forced Hollywood to look at itself and ask a question it had been avoiding for years. What happens when power decides who gets to speak and who doesn't? Because the next chapter reveals how this quiet standoff echoed far beyond two men, and why, years later, the consequences would surface in ways no one expected. But what came next didn't unfold on a set or in a boardroom. It unfolded in the culture itself. And once it did, there was no going back. Every career has turning points. Moments where the path becomes unmistakably clear. Moments where you realize the game isn't just about talent. It's about knowing the rules, and sometimes the people who bend them. For Clint Eastwood, that moment didn't arrive on a red carpet. It didn't come at an awards ceremony. It came quietly, in the subtle refusal of doors to open that should have. You've probably heard about Hollywood politics. Everyone talks about it. Everyone jokes about it. But rarely does anyone really experience it firsthand, and even fewer survive it without compromise. Clint did. The moment of recognition was not dramatic. It was insidious. It started small, a phone call that never came, a project that stalled for reasons no one could explain, a collaborator who suddenly seemed too busy. These are minor annoyances to the casual observer. To someone like Clint, they were patterns. Patterns that painted a picture he could not ignore. It was then he realized, this wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't normal Hollywood delay. Someone, or several someones, was actively trying to shape his opportunities. And according to insiders, one name kept surfacing in these whispered conversations: Rob Reiner. Reiner wasn't just another director or actor with opinions. He was a power broker, a man whose word carried weight in the most influential circles. And more importantly, a man who understood the subtleties of influence. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. He just had to speak, subtly, in the right rooms, to the right people. And the ripple effect would do the rest. For Clint, the realization was uncomfortable but clear. Influence, when misused, can be weaponized. Hollywood had a way of consuming talent quietly, efficiently, invisibly. And Clint Eastwood, despite his fame, was not immune. But here's the difference between Clint and most others. He noticed. Most actors, most creators, ignore the early signs. They assume projects fail due to timing, budget, or creative differences. They assume the system is neutral. Clint did not. He cataloged every slight, every hesitation, every subtle rebuff. He noticed the projects that fell through, the producers who were suddenly unavailable, the scripts that never materialized, and most importantly, he noticed the patterns pointing back to Rob Reiner. This recognition was pivotal, because once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend it isn't real. Once you see the power play, you can no longer act naive. Clint Eastwood made a decision at that point, a decision that would define the rest of his career. He would no longer attempt reconciliation. He would no longer seek validation from those who attempted to control him. And he would no longer allow subtle manipulations to dictate his choices. Instead, he doubled down on autonomy. He chose projects where he had full control. He worked with collaborators he trusted implicitly. He avoided rooms where ideology, rather than artistry, dictated the outcome. And slowly, deliberately, he carved a space in Hollywood that no one could penetrate. But there's a psychological toll to that kind of decision. Isolation, even voluntary, can be heavy. Refusal to bend, even for the most principled reasons, can attract whispers. Silence, in a town that thrives on visibility, can feel like opposition. And Clint knew that. He knew that by stepping away from the influence of people like Reiner, he was making a statement. Not publicly, not theatrically, but clearly enough that those paying attention would notice. Which brings us to the next crucial realization. Hollywood remembers. It remembers those who refuse to play by its unwritten rules. It remembers those who operate outside the channels of influence. And it remembers those who refuse to apologize for the behavior of others. Clint Eastwood became a symbol of independence, of self-determination, a reminder that you can succeed, even thrive, without bowing to every expectation. But symbols are dangerous, too, because they unsettle people who rely on compliance. They threaten systems built on subtle coercion. And in Hollywood, where influence is currency, threatening the system carries consequences. Which is why this moment of recognition, the moment Clint realized what was happening and who was responsible, was both empowering and terrifying. Empowering because he finally understood the dynamics. Terrifying because he understood how quietly and efficiently influence could be weaponized against anyone, even him. And yet, for all the recognition, Clint made a deliberate choice. He would not confront the situation publicly. He would not issue statements. He would not retaliate in visible ways. He would continue doing what he always did, creating films, telling stories, and maintaining control over his craft. But silently, in private circles, the message was unmistakable. He had not forgotten. He had not forgiven. And he would never allow the same kind of manipulation to dictate his career again. That is the moment of recognition. The moment when Clint Eastwood understood Hollywood's invisible rules and chose to operate outside them entirely. And what came next would prove just how far a man willing to stand alone could shape not only his own career, but the way the industry viewed independence, loyalty, and influence. But even with clarity comes tension. Because when power meets principle, the clash isn't immediate. It unfolds quietly, subtly, over years. And the story of Clint Eastwood and Rob Reiner was about to enter that prolonged, invisible battlefield, where the stakes were personal, professional, and cultural all at once. But what came next would test the limits of patience, strategy, and reputation, and reveal the full extent of the silent conflict that had been brewing for decades. Hollywood is a battlefield without uniforms. The weapons are influence, access, and reputation. The battles rarely make headlines. And the casualties are often invisible. For Clint Eastwood, the war with the forces aligned behind Rob Reiner was exactly that, quiet, calculated, and invisible to the public eye. It didn't start with a fistfight or a shouting match. It started with whispers Whispers in production offices. Whispers in agency suites. Whispers during lunches at the most exclusive clubs. Clint might be a risk. He's talented, but difficult. We need to be careful with him. Those are sentences that sound innocent, polite, reasonable, but they carry weight. Because in Hollywood, perception is reality. Once someone like Rob Reiner applies his influence, the whispering begins to ripple. Decisions are subtly shifted. Meetings are rescheduled. Projects stall. Scripts disappear from consideration. And Clint noticed it all. The first time it truly hit him, it was subtle. A project that had been discussed for months. One that should have been greenlit almost immediately. Suddenly stalled. Financing fell through. Producers had second thoughts. Collaborators got cold feet. No one said anything directly. No one had to. The message was clear. And what made it worse wasn't the obstruction itself. It was the realization of intent. Because Clint could see the pattern. He could see the hand guiding it. And it wasn't neutral. This was deliberate. Hollywood insiders confirm that influence, when used in this way, doesn't announce itself. It operates in shadows. It's indirect, almost polite, but it achieves the intended result with precision. And for Clint, the intended result was unmistakable. He was being edged out. Not because he was bad at his craft. Not because he lacked ideas or vision. Not because he had lost favor with audiences. But because someone decided he was a liability. A danger. A variable the industry didn't want to accommodate. It's the kind of pressure that can break careers quietly, without scandal or public feud. And yet, Clint Eastwood reacted differently than most would. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. He didn't compromise. He adapted. He changed the battlefield. Instead of playing in the arenas where influence was wielded, he created his own arenas. Production companies. Independent collaborations. Teams he trusted implicitly. Projects where no one could impose restrictions or expectations based on ideology. And he thrived. That's what made the Quiet War so fascinating. Because Clint wasn't losing. He was winning, but on his own terms. And that, in turn, unsettled people. Because a man like Clint Eastwood succeeding outside the conventional channels exposed the fragility of the system. It showed that influence could be resisted. That manipulation could be sidestepped. That independence could be profitable. And in Hollywood, that's dangerous. Dangerous not because Clint's success threatened anyone financially. Dangerous because it questioned the effectiveness of the tools that power brokers like Rob Reiner had relied upon for decades. So the war continued. Quietly. Indirectly. Invisible to the public eye. There were meetings that didn't happen. There were introductions never made. There were projects quietly shelved. All orchestrated with subtlety and all noticed by Clint. And he cataloged everything. Every slight. Every pattern. Every whisper. Because in this kind of war, memory is a weapon. Most people don't realize that the quietest conflicts are often the most dangerous. They are battles of patience, endurance, and calculation. And Clint Eastwood had patience in spades. He waited. He observed. He learned. And he never forgot. Which brings us to a critical point in this saga, the emotional stakes. Because the Quiet War wasn't just professional. It was personal. Every project denied. Every opportunity sidestepped. Every whispered warning chipped away not just at Clint's career trajectory, but at his sense of fairness, trust, and loyalty. And the emotional weight was real. Imagine dedicating your life to your craft, earning accolades, proving your talent over decades, and then realizing that subtle political maneuvering could determine your access more than your abilities. It's infuriating, and it's humbling. Clint, according to insiders, channeled that frustration not into anger, but into his work. Every film he directed, every performance he delivered, every story he told became a subtle testament to his autonomy. And yet, the tension never fully disappeared, because the war continued quietly in the background. Even when Clint appeared untouchable, even when he seemed above influence, the shadow of the quiet battle lingered. And Hollywood noticed. They noticed how a man who could have bent to the pressures instead chose to sidestep them. They noticed how he operated on his own terms, independent of influence, unaffected by intimidation, and consistently successful. And they understood, whether publicly or privately, that Clint Eastwood had become untouchable in a way that didn't require confrontation. This is the brilliance of his strategy, victory without visible combat. But every war, quiet or otherwise, has consequences. And the ripple effects of Clint's decision would extend far beyond his career. They would influence the way studios evaluated risk, the way agents advised clients, the way emerging actors and filmmakers navigated the invisible currents of Hollywood power. In other words, Clint's quiet resistance became a case study, a lesson, a warning, and it all started with the realization, the moment he understood exactly what was happening behind the scenes. But what came next would push this quiet war into a new phase, one where the stakes were higher, the lines clearer, and the implications far more consequential than anyone could have anticipated. And it was here that the story truly began to reveal its most shocking truths. Every war, no matter how quiet, eventually reaches a tipping point, a moment when patience, observation, and subtle maneuvering give way to clarity, and sometimes action. For Clint Eastwood, that moment arrived not with a confrontation, but with recognition. He recognized that the invisible forces pushing against him were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger system, a system that used influence, reputation, and subtle suggestion to control careers, narratives, and even culture itself. It's easy to underestimate how quietly Hollywood operates. Projects are greenlit based on relationships. Deals are made in private conversations. Access is currency, and it can be denied without fanfare. Clint noticed it all. He cataloged the missed opportunities, the delayed calls, the projects that never materialized. And patterns emerged, patterns pointing unmistakably toward Rob Reiner's influence. That recognition marked the tipping point. Suddenly, the stakes were no longer theoretical. They were personal, professional, and cultural, because it wasn't just about Clint. It was about what his treatment revealed about Hollywood itself. If someone of Clint's stature could be subtly sidelined, what did that mean for everyone else? For emerging actors, for independent filmmakers, for anyone who dared to operate outside the prescribed ideological lines? The realization was sobering, and it forced a choice. Clint could confront it. He could engage publicly. He could challenge the whispers and risk a scandal. Or he could continue his strategy of silent resistance, of operating on his own terms while letting the system overreach in vain. He chose the latter. But even as he solidified that choice, the tension escalated. Because power brokers like Rob Reiner do not act in isolation. They operate within networks, systems, and alliances. When one door closes quietly, another opens strategically elsewhere. When one opportunity is blocked, a cascade of influence can follow, reaching across projects, studios, and collaborators. Clint understood that. He understood that even one person's influence, wielded with precision, could reverberate throughout an entire industry. And that awareness guided his next steps. Instead of attempting reconciliation, he fortified autonomy. He relied on trusted collaborators. He chose projects where creative freedom was guaranteed. He created environments immune to outside pressure. This wasn't just a defensive strategy, it was a declaration. A statement that influence, no matter how sophisticated, could not dictate his career. And yet, the tipping point also carried risk. Because in isolating himself from certain networks, Clint inevitably closed doors. Some opportunities were forever lost. Some relationships remained permanently fractured. But the emotional cost, though high, was worth it. For Clint, autonomy and integrity were non-negotiable. Control over his craft outweighed the fleeting advantages of appeasing others. And this is what made the quiet war so compelling. It wasn't fought with spectacle. It wasn't won with confrontation. It was a war of observation, patience, and strategic withdrawal. And it worked. Clint Eastwood continued to produce iconic work. He maintained creative independence. He retained control over his narrative. But Hollywood noticed. They noticed how someone of Clint's stature could thrive while resisting influence. They noticed the effectiveness of quiet resistance. They noticed the implicit warning it sent to the industry. Power can be resisted. And here's the paradox. The more successfully Clint operated outside influence, the more visible the consequences of that influence became. Studios, agents, and collaborators began to understand just how quietly power could operate, and just how destructive it could be. For the first time, the invisible forces wielded by Rob Reiner and others were no longer entirely effective. Clint's success outside the system highlighted the fragility of influence. And that recognition was the tipping point, not only for Clint, but for Hollywood itself. Because now the story wasn't just about a personal feud. It was about the way power operates behind closed doors. It was about trust, integrity, and the consequences of wielding influence over others. It was about the quiet wars that define careers, shape narratives, and influence culture without ever making headlines. And what came next would reveal the full scope of the silent conflict, the patterns, the strategies, and the emotional stakes that had been building for decades. But what happened after that would be something no one in Hollywood expected. Once Clint Eastwood recognized the patterns, he knew the battlefield had shifted. This wasn't a conflict he could fight conventionally. It wasn't about raising his voice or confronting people in public. It was about survival, autonomy, and maintaining control over his craft. So he made a strategic decision: withdrawal. Not retreat, not surrender, but a deliberate removal from arenas where influence could be used against him. This is the subtle brilliance of Clint Eastwood. He didn't need the approval of the Hollywood elite. He didn't need the validation of gatekeepers. He didn't need the cooperation of people like Rob Reiner to continue building his legacy. He already had the tools to operate independently, and he used them. Projects that might have relied on external approval, he produced through his own companies. Scripts that could have been vulnerable to outside interference, he controlled development from start to finish. Collaborators who could be influenced by political or social pressures. He worked with people he trusted implicitly. The strategic withdrawal wasn't about isolation, it was about empowerment. It was about creating a space where influence had no leverage. But even withdrawal carries consequences. Doors close. Opportunities are lost. Relationships remain fractured. And yet, for Clint, the cost was worth the price. Because what he gained was far more valuable: autonomy, control over his craft, freedom from manipulation. And it wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Hollywood operates on loyalty, reputation, and perceived alignment. When someone steps outside that system, even silently, it sends a message that can unsettle people, a message that can challenge authority, a message that quietly shifts power dynamics. Clint's strategic withdrawal did exactly that. By removing himself from arenas where influence mattered, he became a symbol of independence, a symbol of resistance, a symbol of what it looks like to thrive outside a system designed to control. And Hollywood noticed. Executives, producers, and collaborators all understood the implications. If Clint Eastwood could succeed without bending to influence, anyone could, if they had the courage, patience, and strategic insight. And that realization was threatening, because influence loses potency when its targets are aware and prepared. And Clint Eastwood was both aware and prepared. The strategic withdrawal also forced Hollywood to confront its own methods. It highlighted the subtle power plays that rarely made headlines. It exposed the quiet manipulation that defined careers. And it demonstrated that autonomy could not only survive, but flourish in the face of systemic pressure. But withdrawal wasn't a single act. It was a continuous strategy. Every project Clint chose, every collaboration he accepted, every public appearance, or lack thereof, each was carefully considered, and each sent a message without needing words. This was a war waged through choices, not confrontation, through absence, not aggression, through autonomy, not apology. And it worked. Clint Eastwood continued to create iconic films, win awards, and shape Hollywood culture, all while operating outside the channels of influence that had attempted to control him. But strategic withdrawal also carries tension, because when you remove yourself from a system, you inevitably observe it from the outside. You see patterns more clearly. You see consequences more vividly. And you see the human cost of manipulation in ways those inside the system often cannot. Clint saw it all. He cataloged it. And he never forgot it. Which brings us to the next critical element, the long memory. Clint Eastwood's refusal to forgive or forget wasn't about bitterness. It was about principle. It was about understanding the system. It was about ensuring that he would never be quietly manipulated again. And that long memory would guide every decision, every collaboration, and every project he undertook in the decades to come. But what happened next would take this quiet conflict to another level, where consequences, opportunity, and reputation collided in ways no one anticipated. And the ripple effects of that collision would echo far beyond any single film. any single studio, or any single individual. Memory is a peculiar weapon. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It quietly shapes decisions, informs strategy, and preserves lessons long after the moment has passed. For Clint Eastwood, memory was everything. He remembered every subtle slight, every project that stalled, every meeting that never happened, every whispered word that shaped opportunity without ever being spoken aloud. And he cataloged it all, not with bitterness, not with obsession, but with precision. Because in Hollywood, the quietest offenses are often the most effective. They are invisible. They are deniable. They are forgettable to everyone except the person being affected. And Clint never forgot. According to insiders, this long memory guided every professional decision he made from that point forward. Every project he accepted, every collaborator he trusted, every studio he engaged with. It wasn't about revenge. It was about control. Because Hollywood, at its core, is about influence. And influence is most potent when it goes unchallenged. Clint Eastwood challenged it simply by remembering, by never letting patterns go unnoticed, by never allowing subtle manipulations to become normalized, by refusing to give power to those who had attempted to limit him. And here's the fascinating part. This long memory didn't isolate him from opportunity. It created it. By understanding who could be trusted, who could be relied upon, and who had ulterior motives, Clint was able to navigate Hollywood's invisible power structures more effectively than most. He built an ecosystem where his work could flourish without interference, where creativity mattered more than influence, where autonomy was respected because it was absolute. But memory is double-edged, because remembering also means carrying knowledge of betrayal, of quiet battles, of the moments when trust was broken, and that awareness influences behavior in profound ways. Clint's long memory shaped his relationships, his collaborations, and his professional alliances. It dictated when he would engage and when he would step away, when he would speak and when silence was more powerful. And it had consequences. Some doors were never reopened. Some alliances never rebuilt. Some opportunities permanently lost because the people involved had been deemed untrustworthy. But Clint was unconcerned, because he understood something that many Hollywood players do not. Opportunity without integrity is hollow. Power without control is fleeting. And influence wielded against you can only succeed if you forget it. Clint never forgot. And that long memory became a quiet statement to the industry. It said, "I am not naive. I am not compliant. I am not manipulable." And that statement carried weight. People noticed. Executives noticed. Collaborators noticed. And the ripple effects extended far beyond Clint himself. Hollywood, for the first time, had to recognize that influence could fail, that subtle coercion could be circumvented, that autonomy could not only survive, it could thrive. But memory also brought reflection, because observing these patterns, witnessing the quiet manipulation of careers, and understanding the human cost, Clint began to see the broader implications. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone navigating Hollywood's invisible structures. And the realization was sobering. Because if someone like Clint Eastwood could experience subtle sidelining, what did that mean for those without leverage, without reputation, without autonomy? It meant that the system was fragile, invisible, and potentially ruthless. It also meant that power could be resisted, but only if one remembered, observed, and acted with strategy. And Clint did all three. He remembered. He observed. He acted, not through confrontation, but through choice. Through strategic withdrawal, selective collaboration, and absolute autonomy. And in doing so, he set an example few could ignore. A silent but powerful message echoed through the industry. Influence may be wielded, but memory is immunity. And while Hollywood continued to operate with its invisible rules, Clint Eastwood became proof that the rules could be bent, or even broken, without sacrificing success. But what came next would test just how far that long memory could extend. Because in Hollywood, even the quietest wars eventually reach a point where memory collides with action, and choices made decades earlier begin to reshape not just careers, but the culture itself. And the moment when that collision occurred would shock even those who thought they understood the full story. Hollywood is powered by influence. It is invisible, pervasive, and often decisive. A single recommendation, a whispered warning, A well-placed opinion can determine who gets to work and who doesn't. But influence, as Clint Eastwood discovered, has limits. Even in a town built on hierarchy, politics, and social leverage, a person with autonomy, reputation, and a long memory can operate outside the usual channels and even thrive. Clint's career became a case study in this principle. Projects that could have been blocked, delayed, or sabotaged continued to move forward under his control. Scripts that might have been denied or rewritten were realized through his production companies. Collaborators who could have been swayed by outside pressure remained aligned with him because he had established trust over decades. Influence works best when it is subtle and unquestioned. Clint made it questionable. By understanding the patterns, anticipating the maneuvers, and building insulated channels for creativity, he effectively neutralized the impact of power players like Rob Reiner. But influence doesn't disappear. It adapts. It shifts. It looks for new vulnerabilities. And Clint had to remain vigilant. Even when success seemed absolute, even when autonomy was protected, he understood that influence is persistent. It can reemerge in unexpected ways. Through new collaborators, new studios, or changing political climates. Through subtle pressure disguised as advice or concern. That's the genius of Clint's approach. He didn't try to eliminate influence. He learned to operate alongside it, around it, and in spite of it. And that required discipline. Discipline to choose which battles mattered. Discipline to maintain strategic withdrawal without letting isolation become stagnation. Discipline to trust selectively, but never blindly. In doing so, Clint turned influence from a threat into a predictable variable. He anticipated it. He mitigated it. And he used it, when necessary, as part of his own strategy. But there is an emotional dimension to influence that is harder to navigate. Because influence is not neutral. It carries moral weight. It carries human consequences. Clint witnessed how influence affected careers, relationships, and even personal integrity. He saw talented individuals silenced by fear. He saw collaborators compromise their principles to advance. He saw the system reward compliance and punish independence. And he understood that, while he had survived it, others might not. This awareness shaped every decision. Every project he took, every collaborator he trusted, every choice to engage or disengage with the industry's network of power. And it reinforced a fundamental principle. Autonomy is the ultimate protection against manipulation. Influence can pressure, cajole, and persuade, but it cannot compel someone who controls their own path. Clint's career, particularly in the years following his recognition of these patterns, became an embodiment of that principle. It was not about defiance for its own sake. It was about survival, integrity, and control. And it worked. Awards, box office success, and cultural impact continued to accumulate despite, or perhaps because of, his independence. Yet, as the influence around him continued to operate, Clint's strategy had to evolve. Because Hollywood is never static. The players change, the dynamics shift, and the rules, unwritten though they are, constantly evolve. Clint had to remain adaptive while remaining principled. A delicate balance. And that balance, tested over decades, proved that influence has limits, especially when faced with foresight, discipline, and autonomy. But even as he succeeded, Clint understood the broader lesson. Influence can be resisted. Patterns can be recognized. Power can be sidestepped. But it requires patience, memory, and strategy. And the next chapter would reveal just how these principles played out in specific projects, collaborations, and moments where Hollywood's invisible hand attempted to intervene and failed. Because what came next was not theory, it was practice. And the consequences of that practice would reverberate throughout the industry in ways few could anticipate. Hollywood is built on projects. Scripts, financing, casting, these are the lifeblood of the industry. And controlling which projects move forward is one of the most subtle and effective ways to wield influence. For Clint Eastwood, this battlefield became immediately apparent. Projects he was naturally suited for, ones he had a vision for or a personal connection to, suddenly encountered resistance. Greenlights stalled. Financing was questioned. Collaborators, mysteriously, became unavailable. To an outsider, it might have looked like coincidence, a normal part of an unpredictable industry. But Clint, and those close to him, recognized the pattern. The resistance wasn't random. It was orchestrated, and it pointed squarely back to individuals like Rob Reiner and others who wielded influence quietly but effectively. This was the first major manifestation of Hollywood's invisible war. It wasn't public. It wasn't confrontational. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but devastating if you didn't notice it. And Clint noticed. Instead of panicking or compromising, he acted strategically. He took control of projects from inception to execution. He created his own production channels. He surrounded himself with collaborators who were loyal, capable, and resistant to outside pressure. And slowly, projects that might have been derailed began to flourish. This wasn't luck. It was planning, observation, the careful application of lessons learned from years of experience navigating Hollywood's unseen power structures. At the same time, Clint's choices sent a clear message. You cannot control me by undermining my projects. And Hollywood noticed. Executives, agents, and collaborators began to understand that even with influence, there were limits. Clint's strategic withdrawal, combined with his long memory, insulated him from the most subtle forms of sabotage. But the battle over projects wasn't just about success. It was about principle. By controlling which films he directed and produced, Clint preserved creative integrity. He ensured that his work reflected his vision, not the priorities of those attempting to manipulate outcomes. And in doing so, he set a precedent. A precedent that autonomy could succeed where influence tried and failed to intervene. Yet even as he built this protective framework, the emotional stakes remained high. Every project delayed, every opportunity blocked, every subtle manipulation left a mark. It reinforced why he had chosen withdrawal. It reminded him why memory mattered. And it proved that Hollywood's invisible power structures could be resisted, but only with awareness, strategy, and absolute control over your own path. This is where Clint's genius became clear. He didn't fight influence head-on. He didn't publicly confront those attempting to sideline him. He circumvented it. He outmaneuvered it quietly, methodically, and effectively, and the results spoke for themselves. Films succeeded. Awards followed. Audiences responded, all while influence failed to dictate his outcomes. But there's a deeper lesson here, one Hollywood rarely acknowledges. Influence is not absolute. It can be resisted. It can be anticipated. It can be neutralized. And Clint Eastwood became living proof. But even as he navigated this complex battlefield of projects, influence continued to shift. New players entered, new opportunities emerged, and the patterns that once seemed predictable began to evolve. This constant adaptation became another layer of the silent war, a war that Clint had not only survived but mastered. And what came next would reveal just how far his autonomy, long memory, and strategic withdrawal had reshaped his career and forced Hollywood to acknowledge limits it had rarely faced before. But even with victories in the project arena, the emotional and professional tension was far from over. Because in Hollywood, even quiet wars eventually demand recognition and confrontation in one form or another. In Hollywood, silence is a weapon as much as a shield. It can protect you. It can isolate you. It can communicate more than words ever could. For Clint Eastwood, silence became a strategic tool. He didn't confront. He didn't publicly accuse. He didn't issue statements or engage in public spats. Instead, he let his work, his choices, and his absence speak volumes. Silence has power. It forces people to interpret your actions. It exposes their assumptions. It makes them fill in the gaps with their own fears, doubts, and biases. And in Clint's case, silence served multiple purposes. It preserved autonomy. It protected creative freedom. It allowed him to avoid unnecessary conflict. But silence has a cost. Because when you refuse to respond, the world begins to speculate. Rumors take root. Stories are written without context. Allegiances are questioned. And for Clint, part of the emotional toll was watching others misinterpret him. People assumed arrogance. People assumed defiance for its own sake. People assumed vendettas, none of which were true. Clint's silence was not about ego. It was about principle, about survival, about maintaining integrity in a system that often rewarded manipulation over merit. And yet, silence also meant carrying the burden privately. Every slight, every blocked project, every indirect attack, they were cataloged, remembered, analyzed. He never forgot. not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted clarity. Clarity allowed him to navigate the system effectively, to anticipate moves, to protect himself and his collaborators, to preserve control over his work. But the cost was emotional isolation. By refusing to engage with those attempting to manipulate him, Clint sometimes found himself alone in critical conversations, excluded from opportunities that required compromise or negotiation, separated from networks that could have facilitated additional collaborations. And yet, even in isolation, he thrived, because he had learned the ultimate lesson about influence. You can resist it, but you must also create alternative paths. And that is what Clint did. He built his own channels. He established trusted networks. He curated collaborators who valued integrity over expedience. Silence, combined with strategy, became a shield and a sword. But there's an irony here. The very silence that protected him also fueled speculation.